At dawn, on the west bank of the Nile, across the river from the city the Greeks would later call Thebes, two figures sit alone on the flat ground. They are seated the way a king sits, hands on knees, staring east into the rising sun. Each one was cut from a single mass of quartzite. Each one rises about 18 meters from base to crown, and each one weighs, by the most common estimates, around 700 tons. They have sat on that plain for more than 3,000 years. Behind them once stood a great mortuary temple that has almost entirely vanished. The statues stayed, and standing at their feet in the cold morning light, the hardest question is also the simplest. How does anyone move 700 tons of solid stone across open desert and set it down, upright and exact, in a place with no quarry for hundreds of kilometers in any direction? There is an answer, and it is better than the legend of endless slaves and endless whips. It survives in a painting almost 4,000 years old, on the wall of a tomb, and it shows the device at work. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The version you have probably heard goes like this. The Egyptians had endless labor and endless time. They dragged their monuments on wooden sledges, pulled by hundreds of men on ropes, hauling by sheer numbers until the stone reached its place. There is truth in that picture. The manpower was real, the sledges were real, the ropes were real, but brute force on its own runs into a wall almost at once, and the wall is friction. Drag a heavy sledge across dry sand and the sand does not stay flat. It bunches up in front of the runners into a rising bank, and that bank grows with every step until the whole load stalls. You can add more men. The bank still forms. Somewhere in front of the sledge, something has to stop the sand from fighting back. The plain version of the story never says what that something was. The Egyptians did, they left it on a wall. Moving giants was not a rare event for these people. It was something they did again and again, across 2,000 years. They quarried single obelisks taller than a modern building and stood them on end. They floated blocks the size of houses down the river. They cut, hauled, and raised stone at a scale that still stops visitors in their tracks. A civilization that does a difficult thing once might have stumbled into luck. A civilization that does it constantly, for 20 centuries, all over its territory, has a method, a trade, people who grow old knowing how it is done. The Colossi are not a single impossible outlier. They sit inside a long habit of moving the unmovable, and somewhere in that habit was a body of practical knowledge, passed hand to hand on the ropes and at the quarry face, that we are still reassembling from paintings and stray inscriptions and, now, from a tray of sand in a laboratory. About halfway between the old capitals of the north and the temples of the south, at a place now called Deir el-Bersha, there is a cliff cut through with the tombs of Middle Kingdom noblemen. One of them belonged to a provincial governor named Djehutihotep, who lived nearly 4,000 years ago, in the age when Egypt was ruled from the north, and its art was at its most confident. On one wall of his tomb, faded now but still readable, is a scene unlike almost anything else that survives from the ancient world. It shows a colossal statue, a seated figure, a portrait of the governor himself, carved from pale stone and mounted on a heavy wooden sledge. In front of the sledge, in 4 long rows, 172 men lean back against ropes. You can see the strain in the way they are drawn, bodies angled, arms taut. Overseers stand along the lines. On the knee of the statue itself, a small figure beats time so the pull stays together. And carved beside the scene, in columns of hieroglyphs, the tomb records the event the way the governor wanted it remembered. The stone was enormous. The road was hard. Great crowds were brought to haul it. The achievement was worth putting on a wall for eternity. This is not a myth about gods lifting stone with a gesture. It is a work log, written in paint and rock, by people who moved a giant and wanted you to know how many hands it took. Spend a moment with how ordinary the scene is trying to be. There is no god in it lifting the stone. There is no beam of light, no miracle. There is wood, and rope, and a great many tired men in rows, and a foreman keeping the rhythm, and one figure with a water jar doing a job that looks, at a glance, like almost nothing. That plainness is the most valuable thing about the painting. It is the difference between a story about how the ancients might have done it and a record of how they actually did, drawn by the people who were standing there. Before we go any further, One thing needs saying plainly. This is a channel about the questions the ancient world has not finished answering. Some of what we look at is solid and documented, sitting in a museum or carved into a wall you can still visit. Some of it is theory, and where a thing crosses from fact into guess, I will tell you. The point is not to hand you a verdict, it is to show you what is actually there and let you decide what it means. Look again at the front of the sledge, because there is one figure in that painting who does not fit the simple story of men pulling rope. He is standing on the sledge itself, out ahead of the statue, at the very front edge where the wooden runners meet the ground. And he is pouring. From a jar in his hands, a stream of liquid falls onto the sand directly in the path of the sledge, just before the runners reach it. For a long time, scholars looked at that figure and saw a priest. The reading was that he was performing a rite, purifying the ground, pouring a sacred offering so the statue would pass over clean earth. Egyptians did pour libations, and the reading was reasonable, so it held for years. But it leaves a small thing unexplained, and the small thing turns out to matter. If the pouring were only a ritual, it would not need to be so exact. It would not need to happen at that precise line, right at the runners, right before contact, time to the pull. A blessing can be poured anywhere. This is poured at one spot, over and over, for a reason that has nothing to do with prayer. In the year 2014, a laboratory at the University of Amsterdam decided to test the thing directly. They built a small loaded sled and pulled it across a tray of sand while measuring exactly how much force it took. First, they used dry sand. The sled dug in, a bank of sand piled up in front, and the force needed to keep it moving stayed high. Then they wetted the sand, a little at a time, and pulled again. The numbers changed. With the right amount of water, the grains of sand stick to each other through tiny bridges of moisture between them. The surface firms up, the bank in front stops forming, the sled glides instead of plowing, and the force needed to move it drops by roughly half. Half the friction means half the men, or the same men moving twice the weight. But the effect only works inside a narrow range. Too little water and nothing changes, the sand stays loose. Too much water and the bridges collapse into mud, and the sled sinks and sticks again. There is a correct amount, and it is not obvious, and getting it wrong in either direction throws the advantage away. Now go back to the painting. There is a man on the front of that sledge whose entire task, 4,000 years before anyone measured the physics, was to pour exactly that correct amount onto exactly that spot. Everything about that figure, once dismissed as ceremony, turns out to be the most technical role on the whole team. The man with the water jar is the device. If that sounds strange, it is something almost everyone has felt without ever naming it. Dry sand will not hold a shape. Squeeze a handful and it runs straight out through your fingers. Wet it a little, the way sand sits near the waterline on a beach, and it packs. It holds an edge, you can build with it. Soak it through and it slumps back into a soup that holds nothing at all. Every child who has ever built something on a beach has run the same experiment the Egyptians ran, and found the same narrow band where damp sand becomes firm enough to trust. The builders at Deir el-Bersha took that everyday fact and pointed it at a 60-ton statue, and put a man in charge of holding the ground in exactly that state, foot by foot, the entire length of the hall. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. That solves the statue in the painting. It does not yet solve the two giants on the plain at Thebes, and the gap between them is the part worth sitting with. The seated figure Djehutihotep moved was large. By many estimates, it weighed somewhere near 60 tons, a genuine feat, worth the crowds and the ropes and the wall it was painted on. The Colossi of Memnon weigh around 700 tons each. That is more than 10 times the load. And the stone they are made of does not come from anywhere near where they sit. Quartzite of the kind these statues are carved from appears to have been quarried far to the north, near what is now Cairo, which would mean the finished or half-finished stone had to travel more than 600 kilometers to reach the western plain of Thebes. Part of that journey could go by river, floated on barges when the Nile ran high, but the stone still had to be dragged from the quarry down to the water, and from the water up to its final place. And at each end of that trip the same problem returns, magnified. 700 tons is not 60 tons with more men behind it. It is a different order of problem, and honesty requires saying so. The river itself was part of the plan. Once a year, the Nile rose and spread across the fields in a flood the whole civilization was built around, and while the water was high, boats could reach places that were dry ground the rest of the year. A statue dragged to the riverbank in one season could be floated much closer to its destination in another, carried on barges lashed together to spread the enormous weight. But a barge does not load itself. At the quarry end, the stone had to be brought overland to the water. At the temple end, it had to be brought from the water to its foundation. The river shortened the middle of the journey. It did nothing for the two ends, and the two ends were exactly where the sledge and the sand and the man with the jar earned their place. The honest seam runs right through the middle of this, and it should. The wet sand method is demonstrated. We can measure it in a laboratory, and we can watch the man performing it on a 4,000-year-old wall. What we have documented is the technique working for a statue on the order of 60 tons. Scaling that same trick up to 700 tons and doing it across hundreds of kilometers of varied ground is not something any surviving painting shows us step by step. It is where careful reconstruction takes over from direct evidence. The physics does not break at large scale. Firmer sand still means less friction whether the load is small or huge, but the practical demands climb fast. A sledge strong enough to carry 700 tons is itself an enormous object, and the wood to build it, the rope to pull it, the number of men on the lines, the strength of the road beneath it, all of that grows past anything we have a picture of. We know the principle they used, we can prove the principle works. The full engineering of the very largest statues, the biggest sledges, the longest hauls, remains a reconstruction rather than a record. That is the plain truth of it, and it is more interesting than pretending we hold the whole answer. There is a second problem the sliding trick does not touch, and it shows up at the end of every journey. Moving a giant is one thing, setting it down is another. When the two colossi were placed, they were seated upright, matched to each other, aligned to face the sunrise and to frame the entrance of a temple that once stood behind them. Getting 700 tons to slide is a matter of friction. Getting it to stop in exactly the right spot, turned the right way, level and true, is a matter of control that ropes and wet sand alone do not fully account for. Somewhere in that final stage there was judgment and method we can only partly reconstruct. To feel how hard even a fraction of this is, it helps to look at a much later attempt by people who had iron tools and written engineering. In 1816, a former circus strongman turned collector named Giovanni Belzoni set out to move a single colossal head, the broken upper portion of a statue of Ramesses, from a temple near Thebes down to the river. That head weighed around 7 tons, not 700, 7. With levers, wooden rollers, ropes, and dozens of men, it took him weeks of daily labor to inch that one fragment to the Nile. A piece 1/100th the weight of a colossus, moved by a determined engineer of the modern age, cost him weeks. Then stand again at the feet of the two giants and remember that the people who set them there did it with the whole statue and did it more than 3,000 years ago. So put the pieces together, because they do resolve into something clear. The device that moved the colossi across the desert has nothing to do with lost engines or unknown power. It was something simpler and, in its way, more impressive. It was a method of turning the ground itself into an ally, a wooden sledge to carry the weight, hundreds of hands on ropes to supply the force, and, at the front, the part that made the whole thing possible, a man wetting the sand to the exact point where loose grains locked together and stopped fighting the load. That single act, repeated at the right spot with the right amount, cut the effort roughly in half, and let a small nation of laborers move a mountain of stone. The Egyptians left us something better than a physics paper about the moisture between grains of sand. They painted the man doing the job onto the wall of a tomb, put his water jar in his hands, and left him there for 4,000 years, waiting for someone to understand what they were looking at. The knowledge was never hidden. It sat in plain sight the whole time, in a faded scene most visitors walked straight past, and it took the modern world until the last decade to test it and admit that the man with the jar knew precisely what he was doing. And still, the plain at Thebes holds its part of the question back. The painting shows the method for a statue of dozens of tons, and physics has confirmed that method down to the numbers. The two figures on the western bank weigh 10 times as much, and traveled 10 times as far, and were set upright with a precision the sliding trick alone does not finish explaining. The wet sand carries us most of the way to the smaller statue in the tomb. It leaves us standing at the base of the larger problem, looking up. We can read the hieroglyphs beside the governor's colossus. We can measure the friction in a tray of sand. We can watch a 19th century engineer sweat for weeks over 7 tons and feel the scale of what the ancient builders managed with 700. What we still cannot quite do is walk the whole 700 tons, the whole 600 kilometers in our own minds, step by step, and account for every part of it the way we can account for the man with the jar. The giants are patient about this. They have been sitting there since before the theory existed, staring east, waiting for the sun. And they will keep sitting there, holding the last of the answer, long after we think we have worked the rest of it out. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.